My name is Emily. I was 26 when I realized that the deepest rejection doesn't always come with harsh words. Sometimes it arrives in complete silence. I stood in the hallway, struggling with the zipper on my duffel bag as laughter echoed from the dining room. My parents were celebrating my younger sister Claire's latest achievement. Balloons floated near the ceiling, glasses clinked together, and someone turned the music up just loud enough to drown out everything else, including me. I'd spent the entire afternoon setting the table, cooking dinner, and wrapping a gift I could barely afford. No one seemed to notice. When dessert was served, my father lifted his glass with a proud smile. Claire has always been the one who keeps this family together. The room erupted in applause. I smiled too. It was a smile I'd practiced for years, the kind that hid disappointment so well it almost felt real. By the end of the evening, my face ached from holding it in place. It wasn't the first time they'd chosen her over me. It wasn't even the 100th. But something about those words settled deep inside me. It felt like a lock quietly clicking open, revealing a truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. For years, I'd made excuses for them. Claire was younger. She needed more support. She struggled with confidence. There was always a reason, and I was always the first to defend them before anyone else had the chance. So I became the dependable daughter. The one who never forgot birthdays. The one who covered small bills when money was tight. The one who drove mom to appointments and quietly canceled her own plans whenever the family needed something. Somewhere along the way, I learned that when you're always dependable, people stop seeing you altogether. After dinner, my mother handed Claire a velvet envelope. Inside were the keys to a small apartment they'd secretly helped her buy. The room filled with gasps, cheers, and happy tears. I clapped along with everyone else. No one remembered that only 6 months earlier I'd asked for a short-term loan to finish a professional certification, one that could have changed my career. My parents had exchanged a glance before gently telling me money was simply too tight. Watching Claire cry with happiness, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry. I was exhausted. And those are two very different things. As everyone gathered for family photos, I quietly slipped upstairs to my old bedroom. The walls still carried faint outlines where childhood posters had once hung. My crooked bookshelf leaned against the wall exactly as I remembered. Even the tiny crack in the window caught the porch light the same way it had years ago, when I'd lie awake at 16 wondering why being the good daughter never seemed to be enough. I opened the closet and reached for a single bag. Not a suitcase. Just one bag. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt peaceful. Almost as if a quieter, wiser version of me had made the choice months ago and had simply been waiting for my heart to catch up. As I folded my sweater, my phone vibrated. A message from my grandmother appeared on the screen. "Sweetheart, if your heart is telling you it's time to leave, don't mistake guilt for love." I read those words again and again. Then I took a slow breath and zipped the bag shut. Downstairs, the celebration carried on without missing a beat. No one noticed when the front door opened. No one noticed when it closed. And for the first time in my life, I walked away without looking back. The air outside smelled of rain on fresh pavement. I stood on the sidewalk with a single bag in my hand, listening to the laughter drifting through the walls behind me. It was strange how a house filled with so many memories could suddenly feel like it belonged to someone else's life. I didn't leave a note. After years of trying to explain myself, I no longer saw the point. Every difficult conversation with my parents ended the same way. They called me too sensitive, and somehow I always ended up apologizing for feelings I hadn't chosen. That night, silence felt more truthful than words they were never going to hear. I called my friend Maya. She answered on the second ring. "You sound different," she said gently. "I think I just left home." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Come here. We'll worry about tomorrow when tomorrow gets here." I never forgot those words. There were no grand promises or dramatic speeches, just the quiet reassurance that I didn't have to solve my entire life before the sun came up. The first few weeks were harder than I let anyone see. I rented a tiny room with one small window that looked out at nothing but a brick wall. The radiator rattled through the night, and the kitchen was so cramped I had to dry one plate before I could wash the next. It wasn't much, but every inch of that little space reflected my own decisions, and that kind of freedom felt both unfamiliar and comforting. Money was tight. After finishing my office job each day, I'd spend hours studying for the professional certification I'd almost given up on. My evenings disappeared into textbooks, practice exams, and pages of handwritten notes taped across the wall above my desk. Whenever I felt myself running out of energy, my mind drifted back to the velvet envelope in Claire's hands. Not because I wished it had been mine, because I never wanted to depend on someone else's approval to build my future again. One rainy Saturday, while sorting through old paperwork, I discovered a worn envelope tucked inside one of my notebooks. It was from my grandmother. She had mailed it months earlier. Somehow, I'd never opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Nora, families sometimes mistake familiarity for love. If you ever have to choose between making yourself smaller to keep someone's approval or becoming the person you were meant to be, always choose growth. The people who truly love you will find their way back to you, even if it takes them longer than it should. I folded the letter with care and slipped it into my wallet. From that day on, I carried it everywhere. The weeks quietly turned into months. Home rarely reached out. Eventually, a holiday invitation appeared on my phone. There was no mention of the night I left, no question about how I was doing, and no acknowledgement that I'd vanished from the family home. The message ended with a single sentence. "Claire hopes you'll make it." I read it twice before locking my screen. That's when the truth finally settled in. They hadn't noticed I was gone. They'd only noticed I was no longer there whenever they needed me. Somehow, that realization hurt even more than walking away. And without telling anyone in my family, I made a decision that quietly changed the direction of my life forever. On paper, the decision looked simple. In my heart, it was anything but. I accepted a position with a growing consulting firm in another city. There was nothing glamorous about it. The office overlooked a parking garage instead of a sparkling skyline, and my apartment was barely bigger than the bedroom I'd left behind. But every paycheck meant something far more valuable than comfort. I had earned it on my own. No permission, no approval, no one believing in me before I believed in myself. On my very first day, I arrived 30 minutes early. Some habits take longer to outgrow than others. For years, I'd convinced myself that if I worked a little harder, stayed a little later, or asked for a little less, people would eventually recognize my worth. This time, I made myself a different promise. I would still work hard, but I would never again measure my value by someone else's approval. That quiet promise became part of my daily routine. The months slipped by. One project led to another. Good work opened new doors, and new responsibilities followed. Before long, my manager trusted me with clients who needed patience more than polished presentations. That's when I discovered something I'd never fully appreciated about myself. Listening wasn't a weakness. It was one of my greatest strengths. One afternoon, after wrapping up a presentation, the firm's director caught me just outside the conference room. "You have a rare gift," he said. "People feel heard when they talk to you. You solve difficult problems without making anyone feel insignificant." His words caught me off guard. I smiled, surprised by how deeply they stayed with me. When I got home that evening, I wrote his compliment on a small card and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, right beside my grandmother's letter. Whenever self-doubt found its way back, those two reminders were waiting for me. One came from someone who had believed in me my entire life. The other came from someone who had known me only a short time. Together, they told a story I'd never heard growing up. Nearly a year after leaving home, my life had quietly transformed. I completed my professional certification with top marks. My savings had finally reached the point where a bank notification no longer filled me with anxiety. I even signed the lease on a small apartment where the morning sunlight spilled across the living room floor. The first thing I bought wasn't a sofa or fancy decorations. It was a sturdy wooden bookshelf. As I arranged my favorite books across the shelves, I caught myself smiling. Not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because, for the first time in a long time, it felt peaceful. Then, On an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening, an unfamiliar email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, "Regarding your family." A knot formed in my stomach before I even opened it. The message wasn't from my mother or my father. It was from a lawyer whose last name I recognized immediately. He had handled my grandparents' legal affairs for as long as I could remember. The email was short. "Ms. Ellison, your grandmother has asked me to contact you directly. There are matters concerning your family's financial history that she believes you should know before an upcoming family gathering. Please let me know when you are available to meet." I read it once, then again, and then a third time. The apartment suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. For nearly a year, I believed I had walked away from home carrying nothing but unanswered questions. I had no idea that, all along, someone had been quietly holding the answers for me. 3 days later, I met the lawyer in a quiet office tucked above an old bookstore. Warm sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching tiny specks of dust that drifted lazily through the air. The whole room felt still, as though time had decided to slow down. He greeted me with a gentle smile before placing a thick folder on the table. "I've known your grandparents for a long time," he said. "Your grandmother asked me to give this to you personally." I stared at the folder for a moment before opening it. Inside were bank records, handwritten notes, copies of financial documents, and several letters. At first, it all looked like meaningless paperwork. Then I saw my name. Again. And again. My heartbeat quickened. There were records showing that my grandparents had quietly set aside money for my education years earlier. Another document detailed a separate fund they had created to help me begin my career after graduation. I looked up, completely confused. "I never received any of this." "I know," the lawyer said gently. "According to your grandmother, you are never supposed to be left out." The room fell silent. After a long pause, he explained what had happened. My grandparents had trusted my parents to manage those funds until the right time came. Instead, over the years, much of the money had been redirected to cover Claire's private school tuition, help buy her first car, and eventually contribute to the apartment she received at that family celebration. Nothing illegal had happened. The money had been legally accessible. But the decisions behind those transactions told a story no legal document could soften. I lowered my eyes to the papers. The words slowly blurred together. For years, I'd questioned my own memories. I'd wondered if I'd been too sensitive, if I'd imagined the imbalance, because I wanted so badly to feel seen. Now I was holding proof in my hands. I hadn't imagined any of it. The difference had been documented.
Signed.
Filed away. The lawyer reached into the folder one last time and slid a sealed envelope toward me. "This is from your grandmother," he said quietly. "She asked that you read it when you're alone." That evening, I carried the unopened letter home. I made myself a cup of tea, settled into my favorite chair by the living room window, and waited until the city lights began to glow outside. Only then did I break the seal. "My dear Nora," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've built a life strong enough to hear a difficult truth without letting it define you." My eyes filled with tears before I reached the second paragraph. She wrote about watching me quietly shoulder responsibilities that no one else seemed to notice. She admitted that over the years she'd questioned my parents more than once about the education fund, but every time they assured her everything had been handled fairly. She believed them. Until recently. After reviewing old financial records herself, she finally discovered just how differently her 2 grandchildren had been supported. I read the final lines over and over before carefully folding the letter closed. "Success doesn't erase old wounds, Nora, but it does give you the freedom to stop living inside them. I've invited the whole family to my birthday next month. There are conversations that have waited long enough." I slipped the letter into my wallet beside the note she'd sent me months before. For nearly a year, I'd worked hard to build a future without looking back. Now the past was waiting for me, not as a shadow to chase me, but as a truth that could no longer stay hidden. And this time, I wasn't the only one who knew it. The invitation arrived a week later, printed on thick cream-colored paper, the kind my grandmother had always loved. Her birthday gatherings were never lavish, but they had a way of bringing the whole family together, as though tradition alone could mend whatever had unraveled throughout the year. For a while, I considered staying home. Not because I was afraid of facing my parents or Claire. I simply wasn't sure I wanted to step back into a place where my peace had always come at a cost. But every time I reached for my wallet, I felt my grandmother's letter tucked inside. It no longer felt like a simple invitation. It felt like a quiet promise I needed to keep. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, everything looked almost exactly the same. The white curtains swayed gently in the open windows, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway still ran a few minutes slow. Some places seem untouched by time, even when the people inside them have changed completely. My mother spotted me first. "Nora," she said, her surprise impossible to hide. "We weren't sure you'd come." There was no apology in her voice. No acknowledgement of the months that had passed. Only quiet curiosity. "I wasn't sure either," I replied with a small smile. A few moments later, Claire walked over. She looked different. Not older in years, but older in the way life slowly reshapes a person's expression. We hugged politely, careful not to pretend that everything between us had magically healed. "I've seen your company's updates online," she said. "You're doing really well." "Thanks." She looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "I'm really happy for you." She sounded sincere, but beneath her smile, I caught something harder to define. Maybe regret. Maybe guilt, or maybe the quiet realization that our lives had taken very different paths. As more relatives arrived, the living room filled with easy conversation. People shared old family stories, laughed about childhood memories, and caught up on the milestones they'd missed. A few cousins congratulated me on my promotion after hearing I'd been chosen to lead a major project. I hadn't realized news of my career had traveled that far. Across the room, I noticed my father watching the conversation. He wasn't smiling. For the first time I could remember, he seemed to understand that entire chapters of my life had unfolded without him. Then my grandmother entered the room. She moved slowly, leaning on her cane, but there was nothing fragile about her presence. The quiet strength she'd always carried seemed even more unmistakable now. The room fell silent almost immediately. She thanked everyone for coming, then looked directly at me. Her smile was warm, steady, and filled with quiet determination. After dinner, she walked to the dining table and placed a small wooden box in the center. "I've spent most of my life believing that love speaks for itself," she said gently. She paused before continuing. "But I've learned that sometimes love also has a responsibility to tell the truth." No one said a word. She opened the box and carefully removed several folders. The moment I saw them, I recognized exactly what they were. The same documents the lawyer had shown me. A heavy silence settled over the room as my grandmother rested her hand on the stack of papers. Then she looked around the table. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time we stopped pretending everyone in this family was treated the same." The silence that followed weighed more than any shouting ever could. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one expected to explain it. No one reached for the folders. The room sat in complete silence, interrupted only by the slow ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I'd listened to that clock every Sunday growing up, but this time it sounded different. It was no longer background noise. It felt like a quiet reminder that, sooner or later, time asks all of us to face the truths we've been avoiding. My grandmother opened the first folder. "I've spent the past few weeks going through our family's records," she said calmly. "Not because I wanted to blame anyone, but because I needed to understand what really happened." My father's shoulders tensed. "Mom, this isn't the time." She met his gaze without anger. "I believe it's exactly the right time." Patiently, she walked everyone through the documents. She explained how money that had been intended for both of her granddaughters had, little by little, been used to support only one. There were no accusations, no raised voices, just dates, records, and decisions presented one after another. Paper has a way of speaking for itself. My mother lowered her eyes. "We always plan to make things right later," she whispered. That single word settled heavily in the room. Later. I thought about the birthdays that passed unnoticed, the opportunities I'd quietly let slip away, and all the nights I'd convinced myself that asking for help was simply asking for too much. How long had later been waiting? Claire finally broke the silence. I didn't know. Her voice shook. I knew Mom and Dad helped me, but I never asked where the money came from. For the first time, I wasn't looking at the sister I'd spent years comparing myself to. I saw someone who had also been shaped by choices she hadn't fully understood. She turned toward me, her eyes filling with tears. I'm sorry, Nora. There were no excuses. No attempts to justify what had happened. Only genuine sadness. In that moment, I realized resentment had quietly trapped both of us. I had carried the pain of being overlooked. She had carried expectations she never chose. My grandmother reached into the wooden box one final time. I've updated my estate plans, she said. Not to reward one person or punish another, but to do what I still can while I have the chance, to make things fair. She handed several sealed envelopes to the lawyer, who had quietly joined us after dinner. My parents exchanged anxious glances. I didn't. I felt no sense of triumph, no satisfaction, only a strange, peaceful distance from a battle I no longer needed to fight. For the first time, my future wasn't tied to whatever was inside those envelopes. It was already waiting for me in the life I'd built on my own. As the evening came to an end, my father approached me while the rest of the family lingered in quiet conversation. I don't know if you'll ever forgive us, he said softly, but I finally see what we refused to see for so many years. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I didn't leave because I stopped loving this family, I said. I left because I finally realized I had to love myself, too. Neither of us spoke after that. Some conversations don't end with perfect resolutions. Sometimes, the greatest ending is simply allowing the truth to be heard at last. The weeks after my grandmother's birthday were far quieter than I'd expected. I had braced myself for endless phone calls, emotional confrontations, and desperate attempts to explain away the past. Instead, there was something I hadn't experienced in years. Space. For the first time, no one expected me to carry the responsibility of keeping the family comfortable. One Saturday morning, my father called and asked if we could meet for coffee. My first instinct was to say no. Not because I was angry, because I'd worked hard to protect the peace I'd finally found, and I wasn't sure I wanted to risk losing it. In the end, I agreed. When I saw him, he looked older than I remembered. The quiet confidence that had once filled every conversation had given way to long pauses and thoughtful silence. After a few moments, he looked at me and spoke. I've been thinking about what your grandmother said, he admitted. For years, I convinced myself we were simply helping the child who seemed to need us more. I never realized that every time we chose Claire, we were teaching you that you had to need us less. His words lingered between us. It wasn't the perfect apology, but it was a genuine one. I spent years believing I wasn't enough, I said quietly. Not because you ever told me that, but because your choices kept telling me the same thing. He looked down at his coffee. I know. 2 simple words. No excuses. No attempts to defend the past. Somehow, they meant more than 100 explanations ever could. A few days later, Claire called. She asked if we could walk through the park where we'd spent so much of our childhood. It had been years since we'd been alone together. As we followed the winding path, she stopped beside a small pond and stared out across the water. I've been thinking about everything, she said softly. I always believed you kept your distance because you didn't like me. I gently shook my head. No. I stayed away because every family gathering reminded me of everything I thought I wasn't. She blinked back tears. I never wanted to be the reason you felt invisible. I know. This time, I meant those words with my whole heart. She told me she'd spoken with our parents and insisted on paying back part of the financial support they'd given her over the years. No one had asked her to do it. She simply wanted to know that the future she built belonged to her. It couldn't change what had already happened, but it could change what happened next. When autumn arrived, my grandmother came to visit for tea. She looked around my little apartment before her eyes settled on the wooden bookshelf beside the window. "You've made a beautiful home," she said with a smile. I laughed. "It's pretty small." She smiled back. "So is an acorn," she said. "That doesn't stop it from growing into an oak." Before she left, she placed a tiny brass key in my palm. It belonged to the old cedar chest she'd treasured for decades. "One day," she said gently, "this will be yours." For a moment I looked down at the key. Then I smiled, because I realized I wasn't wondering what might be inside that old chest. For the first time in my life, I understood that the greatest gift she'd ever given me couldn't be locked inside a box. It was the courage to stop measuring my worth by love that had once been given unevenly. And somehow, that felt more valuable than anything money could ever buy. A year after I walked out of my parents' house with nothing but a single bag, I found myself standing in front of a room full of strangers who knew me only through my work. I'd been invited to speak at a leadership conference about resilience, growth, and the lessons that shape us. As I scanned the audience before taking the stage, my heart skipped for a moment. In the back row sat my parents. Claire was beside them. No one had told me they were coming. For an instant, an old feeling resurfaced, the quiet fear that I still had to earn their approval before I could speak with confidence. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. I smiled, stepped up to the microphone, and began. "I used to think success meant proving people wrong," I said. "Now I believe success is building a life where you no longer feel the need to prove anything at all." The room grew still. I wasn't standing there to tell my family's story. I was finally telling my own. When the event ended, people stayed behind to thank me. One by one they drifted away, until only my family remained. My mother was the first to step forward. "I've wanted to say this for a long time," she whispered. "I'm sorry, not only for what we did, but for how long it took us to truly see it." There were tears in her eyes, not the kind that asked me to forget the past, the kind that finally acknowledged it. My father gave a small nod. "We're proud of you." There was a time when I dreamed of hearing those words. Back then, they would have meant everything. Now, they simply felt like a kindness, because I'd already learned to believe them before anyone else said them. Claire wrapped me in a hug. "I hope we can start over," she said. "Not as the favorite and the forgotten, just as sisters." I held her a little tighter. "I'd like that." A few months later, my grandmother placed the little brass key into my hand once again. Together, we unlocked the old cedar chest. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten letters, journals, and small keepsakes collected over a lifetime. Resting on top was a folded note in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. Families aren't remembered for being perfect. They're remembered for the moments they choose honesty over pride. I folded the note with care and tucked it into my wallet beside the letters she'd already given me. It belonged there. Every now and then, someone asks what really changed the night I walked away from home. They expect me to say it was because my parents finally understood, or because success somehow made everything right. But neither answer is true. The person who changed that night was me. I stopped waiting for love to arrive in the form I'd always imagined. I discovered that dignity can fit inside a single bag, that it can walk through uncertain streets, that it can slowly unpack itself into a life built on courage, patience, and self-respect. When I think back to that night now, I don't remember the sound of the front door closing behind me. I remember the silence that came afterward, because in that silence, for the very first time, I heard my own voice. And it whispered the words I'd been waiting to hear all my life. "You're finally going home." Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of Emily's story. If her journey meant something to you, I hope it leaves you with this reminder. Your worth is never determined by favoritism, rejection, or the way others choose to treat you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, not out of anger, but to build a life filled with peace, purpose, and self-respect. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, subscribed to the channel, and shared it with someone who might need to hear this message today. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose yourself, even when it was one of the hardest decisions you've ever made? Your story could be exactly the encouragement someone else needs to keep going. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the next story. Until then, take care of yourself, and never forget that some of life's greatest victories happen quietly, one brave step at a time.